Well, I think it's probably time we made a start. Warm welcome to you all. I hope you're managing to see this. I hope you're managing to hear me. I'm sorry about the confusion over the different channels and all the rest of it, but congratulations if you've managed to work your way around that, and apologies for messing it all up. Sorry about that. Anyway, I haven't seen you for a long time. You have to excuse, please, the very messy shells behind me. I'm sort of halfway through sorting them out, so they're even worse than usual today. Apologies for that. I hope this finds you well. I hope you're all okay, and looking forward, as I am, to getting back to some singing and some music making, and hopefully getting back in a venue where we can all work together in whatever circumstances they're going to be. But I do so hope that we can achieve that. Seeing some of the proms this last couple of weeks has been quite inspiring, because at least it shows that from a performing point of view, at least there is hope for getting stuff going. Quite when we'll be able to have audiences, who knows, but at least that's a start. So today I'm going to start talking about and introducing Bach's B minor Mass. I'm sure some of you know it well, but to others, I'm equally sure that you're probably going to be working with it for the first time. I don't think we've done it before, not in my time anyway, with Croydon. Interestingly for me, it was the last concert I did before lockdown. So I did a performance of this very piece on the 14th of March in Winchester Cathedral with the Hanover Band. And it was particularly moving, as you can imagine, because all of us who were there knew that it was going to be the last concert we did for a long time. And to be able to perform it in that wonderful setting, Winchester Cathedral, with a proper audience, a live audience, was just fabulous, but also very poignant at the same time. So it's a piece that, even if it didn't mean a lot to me before, which it certainly did, of course, it certainly means a heck of a lot to me now. And that memory will stay with me for the rest of my life, I'm sure. As I said, the B minor Mass of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's also, if you've got an old edition, especially an old German edition, it'll say Messe in H moll, and I'll come back to that title in a moment. It never really had a title as a piece, and certainly not in Bach's day. And again, I'll explain that a bit later. First thing to say, as far as I'm concerned, I know that many people consider this work as clearly one of the greatest artistic achievements of Western civilization. I mean, that sounds a huge thing to say, but I can well understand why people say that and why people believe that. It is the most extraordinary piece, and it is the most extraordinary act of creation that one can think of. And so for many people, it's right up there as one of the wonders of the artistic world. Certainly speaking personally, as a choral piece, it would definitely be in my top three. I think the other two would probably be Beethoven's Missa Solemnis and the Verdi Requiem. But so it's literally on a par with those two magnificent pieces. But what about the composer himself and his situation, the circumstances of this piece coming to fruition? If you look at the date, if you look at a date of when this piece was written, it will say 1749, which is just 1 year before Bach died. So yes, very much a late work, a masterwork, an extraordinary piece with which to end his compositional career, so to speak. But of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, because a lot of this piece was material that he'd used before, he'd used for other works. Some of it was in cantatas, some of it had been used for other settings of the Mass. There are some movements which were specifically written for this piece. The wonderful Et Incarnatus movement is a good example of a piece that was specifically written to complete this work. But it's worth just explaining before I go on that in Bach's day, as somebody who worked for the Lutheran Church, as you know, St. Thomas's in Leipzig, the Mass was, normally speaking, what was known as a Lutheran Mass, which was like a shortened version. It wasn't the big Catholic extravaganza that we associate with the word Mass. And so the Lutheran Mass consisted just of the Kyrie movement and the Gloria, the Lord have mercy, and a larger, more substantial movement, the Gloria. That was what a Mass consisted of. And certainly Bach wrote several Lutheran Masses which only have those two movements. But for this was known as the Missa Tota, or the Grand Catholic Mass, or High Mass, as also titled. And the score, or scores, more of that in a moment, came down to Bach's son, C.P. Bach, and then were really laid dormant for many years, so much so that we reckon that the first performance, the first complete performance of this piece, didn't happen until 110 years later in 1859, which is extraordinary to have a work as monumental as this and as outstanding as this piece undoubtedly is, to have it lying dormant for 110 years before it was ever performed is just extraordinary. And of course, one of the things that makes it even more poignant is the fact that Bach almost certainly never heard it, never had it performed in his own lifetime. And it's almost as if he never expected it. It was as if he was creating something which was so big, so huge, so colossal. He was, as it were, writing for posterity, not for the now. And that's very unusual for Bach, because as you know, Bach was the most pragmatic of composers. He was employed to write a cantata for each Sunday. So all of his creative life, he was under the cosh of having to produce the next cantata for the next Sunday and the next Sunday after that, and so on. And most of his music was written for a specific event, a specific purpose, sometimes for a specific day. And the stress and the strain of doing that must have been colossal. Bearing in mind, of course, he didn't just have to write the music, he also had to write out all the parts. He then had to, as it were, cast it, rehearse it, get it ready, and then perform it on the Sunday morning in church. And then he would have to start the whole process again, ready for the next week. And that's without fitting in all his other works, the Brandenburg concertos, the instrumental concertos, all the keyboard works, all the organ works, and everything else. I mean, just astonishing. And then you have to remember, on top of all that, that Bach, as we know, was becoming increasingly blind towards the end of his life. So probably from sitting up very late at night, working on scores, working on manuscripts, writing out parts with very poor light, just a single candle possibly, it had a terrible effect on his eyesight. and was pretty much blind by the end of his life. So to be doing all that and creating what he created is just astonishing. And this piece is just massive in every way. It lasts 2 hours, and that's 2 hours of solid, complex, polyphonic music from beginning to end. And no piece other than the Passions had been anything like as long as in terms of the period of time. Most Baroque music, as you know, is probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the most. To have a complete work lasting 2 hours is just astonishing. As I said, the Passions were equally long. The Matthew Passion is longer still. But the difference there, of course, is that a lot of it is made up of recitative, which is an essential part of telling the story, but it doesn't have the same musical complexity as the music of this work does. So this was definitely the biggest, the longest, the largest scale work that had ever been produced when it was formulated, put together in 1749. It's also big in terms of the scale of the performers required. There are 2 choruses, double chorus. Sometimes they're not always used. Sometimes it's just 5 parts or 6 parts. But at its most, in the hosannas, it's a full double chorus. So it's eight parts for the chorus. There are 5 soloists. There's a large orchestra for the time, consisting of 3 oboes, 2 flutes, 2 bassoons, natural horn, 3 trumpets, timpani, full body of strings, and all the continuing instruments, organs and harpsichords and all that sort of thing. So it's a big, big scale. And as I said, when it was put together in 4 large sections. So whether Bach never intended it to be formed as one, we will never know. But he certainly created the first book, which consisted of the Kyrie and the Gloria, like the Lutheran Mass, which I've referred to. Then there was the Credo, or the Symbolum Nicaeum, which is how it was titled, which contains all the movements of the Credo. The third section was the massive Sanctus, which is the big double choir section, which we will come across quite soon, probably. And then the final 4th section of the work consisted of the hosannas, again, double choir, Benedictus, and another hosanna, obviously repeat of the hosanna, and then the Agnus Dei at the end. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this piece is known as Mass in B minor, or B minor Mass, or Messa in H moll. And I said I would explain what that's about. The thing about B natural, this is at Baroque pitch, this piano at the moment. So that may sound like a B flat, but anyway, for all intents and purposes, that is a B natural. And B natural was a note that composers for generations had really struggled with. Why? Because if you take a scale of C major and you arrive at F, and then you go up 4 notes from F, you get that rather unfortunate interval, the augmented 4th, or tritone, as it's also known. And composers really struggled to know what to do with that B natural. Yes, it was convenient because it leads you back to the C, but what else it does cause them problems. That F and B natural, that tritone, they labeled it the diabolus in musicum, the devil in music, because they felt it sounded horrible and they didn't know what to do with it. So one of the things that they decided, and this is going way, way back into the 16th and the early 17th century, one of the things they decided to do with it, thought, I know, we can make it B flat. So why don't we just call it B flat? So instead of having that B natural, then you simply flatten it And then when you have that F to B, you have a perfect fourth instead of the rather dissonant tritone. So for many decades, literally, if you said the note B to a musician in the 17th century, he would probably, or she would probably think automatically you meant B flat. And if that's the case, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, back to C again, that made a little hole just between the B, or B flat, and the C, and we needed something else to call that note that was in between. So they called it H. So if you think about the names of the notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we're used to, and then we start again. But H was used to describe that B natural. And that very neatly got round the problem of distinguishing between B, which we think of as B flat, the flattened version of B, and the rather nasty natural version of B, which they called H. The other thing about this, of course, is that when you think of the letters of Bach's name, if you think of B as being B flat, you can play a melodic phrase thinking B, A, C, H. So because we've renamed that note B natural H, meant that we now can play the letters of Bach's name, making a nice melodic phrase, which is used not just by him, but by many other composers. Liszt wrote a whole series of fugues based on those four letters, on those four notes, B flat, A, C, H, or B, A, C, H. So there's quite a significant aspect to this piece being in B minor. It's like going out on a limb. It's like saying, okay, you're all frightened of this note, but I think we can really handle it. And to prove it, I'm going to write this massive piece, the biggest piece that's ever been constructed by anybody, and I'm going to put it in B minor. I mean, just to add to all the complications. And one of the things, of course, that many of Bach's contemporaries would have thought was, well, that's just sheer madness. You can't do that. It's not possible. Apart from anything else, it'll sound horrible. We don't like B, and most of the instruments can't play in B minor. Certainly things like trumpets were not much good in B minor. But being Bach, just as with the well-tempered system, how he decided to average out all the intervals so that you could play in all the chromatic keys, it wasn't a problem for him. He just found a way around it, found a way of doing it. But it just shows yet again that here was an attempt to really create something which was intensely special. It's interesting that, of course, although it's called the Mass in B minor, there are actually only 5 movements out of the 27 sections. Only 5 are in B minor. Another 12, I think, are in D, which is, of course, the relative major. So a lot of the time in this piece, although the home key, if you like, is B minor, it actually settles in D major, and a lot of the movements actually incorporate D major as their home key, the relative major of B minor. And of course, that has the great advantage of it enables the trumpets to play, because the trumpets of the time were mostly pitched in D, and they could play all those notes that make up D, and then at the very top they could go chromatic. In fact, so they could play all those notes at the very top, but in the lower part of their register they could only play the natural harmonic series of D. So it's just as well that a lot of the movements, especially the ones that incorporate the trumpets, are in D major. Interesting also that if we just look at the Kyrie, the opening section of this movement, of this piece, the first Kyrie, that one, one. That is in B minor. The Christe liaison, which follows it, is in D major. Nothing unusual there. But then the third movement, the return of the Kyrie, which comes at the end of that section, is in F sharp minor. So the key structure has gone from B minor to D major to F sharp minor. And of course, those three notes form a triad of B minor. So although it's quite an unusual relationship of keys, you can see what the composer had in mind here. So he's not only pitching the whole piece, as it were, under the title of B minor, he's also establishing that triad, B, D, and F sharp, in the three keys of the first three sections of the work. Just another example of the kind of thought process that this composer incorporates. One of the other things that I think is really important to me, and one of the reasons why I love this piece so much, is the sheer versatility of it. I mean, it is, as I've said, a vast piece on a vast scale, but it can also be very intimate. It can be chamber music. It can really adapt to almost any sort of performance. And I want to talk a bit more about that in a moment. But just for the moment, have a think about what we are going to be doing. We're going to be doing this with two choirs, hopefully, put together. So a large choral force and quite a number of instrumentalists and so on in a big space. And it's going to be a big, large section of wonderful sonority. But, and this is the extraordinary thing about this piece, it can also be performed just by one voice per part. There are many recordings, very fine recordings on the market today, where they've literally had one singer per part. So if it's a 5-part chorus, they just use 5 solo singers. If it's an 8-part chorus, they'll use 8 and so on, but a single voice. And you can imagine how that scaling down affects the overall effect, but it works brilliantly. It works just as well as the big scale using literally hundreds of singers. And of course, those soloists are singing the whole thing. It's quite a tour de force in itself, because they've obviously got to sing not only all the choruses, one per part, but they've also got to do all the solo passages as well. So it's an amazing achievement for people who've done it. But for us, we're going to be thinking of it in a slightly larger scale. But even there, the contrasts are amazing. There is every conceivable style of music in this. Everything that had been thought of and created up to the middle part of the 18th century is utilized in some way. So it's got plain song, it's got unison passages, it's got fugues, inevitably, because it's Bach, but he doesn't overdo the fugues by any means. It's not fugue after fugue after fugue. There are lots of, they're nicely spaced out, and they're amazing works when they happen, and they happen for a reason each time. But it also has wonderful instrumental passages, ritornelli, it has arias, it has some of the most dramatic and almost operatic music you can think of. Literally everything that has been thought of up until this point of the mid-18th century has been incorporated into this work in one way or other. The virtuosity that is expected of the players, the virtuosity that is expected of the singers, and as many of you know, when you've sung Bach, Bach doesn't go treat voices lightly. He treats them all as instrumentalists. So anything that a violin can do or an oboe can do, he expects a singer to be able to do equally well. It's one of the things that makes Bach singing so challenging, is because you are literally being treated like an instrument. So it is just that sheer variety that is so exciting and so enthralling. Many of you may be thinking, yes, but it's a liturgical piece. It's a religious work, and I'm not particularly religious. which is a feeling I quite understand. And I would go as far as to say that it's almost to me as if Bach realized this might be the case. It would be almost impossible to perform this piece as part of a church service. So a liturgical performance is very unlikely, I think. I don't know if anybody's tried it, but it will go on for hours and hours, and it's just not suitable for that. And of course it is a religious work, and of course it espouses everything that you expect about Christianity and all of that. And Bach was himself a very profound Christian believer. But somehow it goes further than that. I tend to think of it like a big cathedral. I mean, if you think of your favorite cathedral, whether it's, I don't know, Milan, Barcelona, Salisbury, York Minster, whatever, pick your favorite cathedral. And if you imagine yourself walking into it, yes, it could be a very religious experience, but it doesn't have to be. It also represents so much more, or so much in addition, if you like, to the religious aspect. It is a celebration of everything that human beings can and have achieved. And that's how I tend to think of this. I think of this as literally a celebration of everything that the human being can create. And even more than that, if we think of the three elements of what human beings are capable of, we're very used to thinking everything's being cognitive and the importance of our brains and intelligence and what we can do with our brains. And that's what we tend to reward more than anything at the moment, which is another argument altogether. But we've also got the heart, the element of our human existence, which includes things like compassion and love and imagination and energy and all of those things, all those elements. And then the third element, of course, is handcraft, crafting, skills, physical skills. And what's so important to me is that this piece incorporates all three to a huge, huge level. If you think of the sheer energy, enthusiasm, imagination that the composer would have required, the love of his art to put so much of himself into a piece of this scale, that is absolutely huge. If you think of the skills required, the sheer physical energy, the sheer physical work that would be required to put all this music together, to write it all out, to write out on by hand on manuscript paper every single note, and boy, there are a lot of notes in this piece. So the skill element, the sheer physical element is massive. And as for the cognitive element, well, I mean, it's literally, pardon the pun, it's mind-blowing. It really is. The fact that any one human being could conceive a work on this scale is just astonishing. So to me, it's that fundamental epitome of what the human being, or one extraordinary human being, is capable of. That's what makes it so incredibly special for me as a work of art and as one of my favorite pieces of music. Now, I'm sorry to lecture you so much, but I just hope you get the feeling that I find this piece very, very special indeed. And one of the other things I just wanted to mention, as it were in passing, is the element of performance and how we go about performing a piece of this scale and this grandeur and this complexity. And for many years, of course, it's been done in very different ways by different interpreters. If you look back at some of the early recordings, they're comparatively slow, very often a little bit ponderous, slightly very reverent, but not always desperately exciting. And then around about the middle of the 20th century, sort of 1960s, that kind of time, there came a new outlook on performance practice, and it was known as the authentic versions or the authentic principles of musical performance. In other words, what they were trying to do was to say, okay, in 1749, these are the instruments that they would have had. This is what they sounded like. This is how they'd have been used. And there was a real movement, particularly in places like Germany, Austria, France, and latterly in London, in England as well. And there was a real movement to try and recreate what they thought the music would have sounded like to a listener at the time. Now, the problem with that is that, of course, firstly, nobody really knows. Nobody really knows about the tempi they would have used, or sometimes even the exact pitch. We only know things about pitch from various instruments that have survived. Some of the churches have their organs at a certain pitch and so on. So there are, as it were, historical clues as to what the pitch would have been, whether it was higher or lower than what we could think of as modern A440 pitch. But more significantly still, nobody knows precisely what the composer had in mind. How could they? And although composers like Bach wrote very detailed manuscripts in terms of the notes and the note values, there are no dynamic markings. There are no clues as to the tempo markings. It doesn't even write a tempo indication. It doesn't write moderato or allegro, or not very often. Sometimes he does, but not very often. Most of the time, it just says, this is a time signature. These are minims, off you go. And how are we supposed to interpret that? Similarly, in terms of dynamics, we've got no idea whether things were particularly loud or soft, or whether they had long sweeping crescendos and diminuendos, big rits, slowing down, anything like that. We have really no idea. So that makes it very difficult to say this is an authentic performance. And then perhaps the most fundamental problem of all is the fact that for us, listening to this music in the 21st century, we've heard everything, or a lot of music, that's been produced since 1749. So in other words, we've heard Mozart and Beethoven and Wagner and Strauss and Schoenberg and everything else. And then we've heard Philip Glass and, you know, all the minimalist composers. We've heard so much. We've heard jazz, we've heard world music, we've heard popular music. We've heard everything that's happened in between 1749 and now. So all of that is going to radically change our response to what we are listening to. So for all those reasons, it's not really possible to produce an authentic version of any piece, but certainly not one dating from 1749. So instead, what's tending to happen these days is we go for what's known as hip. Hip, as in this occasion, is spelt H-I-P-P, not H-I-P, although to some people it probably is quite hip, H-I-1-P. But for us, we're talking about hip with two P's, meaning historically influenced performance practice. Historically influenced performance practice. In other words, we're creating something which is new, which is of the present, it's of the now, and it's how we want to perform the music as we feel it should be performed now, today, but taking into consideration all the historical information and performance practice that we can learn about, because that just helps us get a clue, an idea of things like tempi, dynamics, the sort of instruments that we're going to use, the sort of sound they make, and so on. And that's really how I would like to perform, and how I do like to perform the music of Bach and others. I like to take into account all the aspects that we can possibly know about from contemporary writers and people who have written about performance practice of the 18th century, but also all the research that's been done in terms of musical instruments, how they're constructed, how they would sound, and so on, and put all that together with a modern slant, if you like. So taking into account the nature of the building, the acoustics of the building, the comparative virtuosity of the musicians that we've got to work with, and all sorts of other considerations. But the important thing is to produce a performance that works for now, that makes sense for now, but it's still making use of historical research. And that's what HIP is all about, HIPP. And that's very much what we will be doing when it comes to performing. And that's one of the reasons why we will be performing at Baroque pitch, which is roughly a semitone lower than modern pitch. Apart from anything else, it actually makes it more comfortable to sing. And if it's more comfortable to sing, then there's a good chance of it sounding better than if everybody's having to really struggle and strain to get up to high notes. So I hope that makes sense. And I hope that gives you some idea about what is so exciting about this piece and why I think it is so much on a pedestal, as far as I'm concerned, as being one of the greatest works that we could possibly be tackling. So maybe we should have a little look at the final movement. And by the way, when I said, I was talking earlier on about the fact that it was produced in 4 books, almost as if, or 4 sections, 4 major sections, almost as if the composer wasn't really expecting it to be done in one go. But the interesting thing about this final movement, the Dona Nobis Pacem, musically, it's exactly the same as the Gratias Agimus Tibi, which is part of the Gloria movement. So although who knows whether he intended it to be sung as one or not, the fact that there is this kind of coming together, this unity, this use of the same material near the beginning of the work that comes back at the end for this very, very pivotal movement that give Lord grant us peace, Dona Nobis Pacem. And that's one of the things which makes me feel that maybe the composer did expect it or did hope that it would be performed as one great event, even though it wasn't possible to do it in his own lifetime. And what a sad thought that is. So let's have a look at this final movement, the very, very end of the piece. I'm sure you can find it. I'm afraid I've got a different edition from you, but it will be the very last movement of the work. And I thought perhaps we could start by just listening to it once, and then we'll have a go and see if we can sing it. Sorry about that. Well, I hope you could hear that okay. I hope it didn't sound too awful over the system. But you notice how this movement starts really quite quietly, just a single line, become in the bass line, and then you have this imitation as each part comes in. So it starts really quite gently, but it builds and it keeps on building. It's like the most glorious kind of sunset, or sunrise rather. And it has that wonderful expectation that you know it's going to get bigger and you know it's going to expand in every way. And of course, towards the end, when the trumpets come in and they just keep this very simple scale, and the scale keeps going all the way up to a top D, which is the highest note pretty much that the trumpets can play. And when you have that coming out over the top of the texture, it just produces this wonderful, wonderful feeling of exultant pleading for peace on earth, and the kind of ultimate sentiment that we could all identify with. So let's have a little go. We'll have a go with the piano. And if you can sing along, that'd be great. I'd recommend that you take it very, very gently. If you like, just hum. So don't worry too much about the words, or if you get bored of humming, then by all means add the words. But I think one of the things we've been told, haven't we, that in terms of singing, when we come together, we're apparently supposed to sing quietly because that produces less aerosol than singing very lustily and loudly. So maybe it's something we're going to have to get used to. But just please yourself, whether you want to hum or sing exactly what's written, it's entirely up to you. But don't worry too much, because what we'll do is just have a very gentle sing through, do the best you can, and then maybe we'll have another go singing along with, in this case, the Monteverdi choir. So there's the bass note, first note, ready, and. Trumpets come in. Good. Now, no doubt, like me, you're thinking, this is all very well, but I want to be in a room with other people and other singers singing my part, and I want to be working all together. None of this over screen business trying to sing on my own. It's so much more difficult, I know, and I can only say how impressed I am that you and many other singers in this country have carried on in spite of everything, determined to keep singing in some way or other, in spite of all the horrible difficulties and technical challenges which this all throws up. But well done if you managed to get something out vocally between in that session. Maybe we should, as I suggested, maybe we should go back and have another go with the Monteverdi Choir and John Eliot Gardner, because at least then we've got some vocal support that we can join. So let's try that. We'll go back and sing along to the Monteverdi Choir. Here we go. I've just realized that all the windows and doors in the house are wide open because it's been quite warm today. So I've obviously been broadcasting to the entire village. I hope they enjoyed it. They're probably quite used to the racket coming out of here. And the fact that it's now pitch dark outside reminds me that I've probably gone on far too long and rambled on and on and on and bored you all silly. So I will conclude this session now. And just to say, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking part. As you may know, we've got a committee meeting this Friday to discuss just what might be possible, how we can proceed, and what will the best ways will be of proceeding. So if you have any thoughts or any ideas or anything you want to say, then do contact me or a member of the committee, and we can discuss it all on Friday. And hoping that we can get some way of finding some way of being able to get together, even if it's in small numbers, in the near future. Can I just finish also by saying a huge thank you to Jane, to Katerina and Pedro and all the other members of the committee for their fantastic work in keeping everything going under these appallingly difficult and challenging times. So I personally am very grateful to them for everything they're doing. And I know it's quite a thankless task at the moment with loads and loads of work and not much to show for it for obvious reasons. So hoping that I will be able to see you in person before too long. Thank you very much again. Take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you next week and hopefully in person sometime soon. Good night to you all, and happy Bach listening. Bye for now.